Hello, everyone. I'm Kevin Gosztola, and welcome to this interview. I'm very, very pleased to be joined by Andrew Cockburn, who's a DC editor for Harper's magazine, and he recently wrote a feature for them called Alternative Facts: How the Media Failed Julian Assange. And so I'm very pleased that he can join me and talk about his recent report. So thank you, Andrew.
Hey, great to be with you.
And I just want to say first, I must disclose and thank you for including my book in your report, the forthcoming Guilty of Journalism, the political case against Julian Assange. I just appreciated you incorporating that into your accounting. And what this feature story was really all about was taking a look at the media and their treatment of Julian Assange and going through some of the more salient examples of how they had misrepresented him deliberately in a manner that really, in my view, aids and abets the prosecution. So to begin, those examples are the core part of your story, but I think it's good to just begin with the basics of what you feel is WikiLeaks' main contribution to journalism and why they should be defended, and what you believe as the journalist writing this piece is at stake if Julian Assange is prosecuted under the Espionage Act or just prosecuted in the United States at all for the work that he's done with WikiLeaks.
Sure. Well, the importance of WikiLeaks is that it's really opened the window into how we are ruled. I mean, what the powers that be, the power that is, particularly the national security state, actually operates. I mean, what we get most of the time from journalism, even, there's a lot of good journalism out there, or less and less, I feel, but still, is so often this a matter of negotiation, like the New York Times will have we'll go to the CIA saying, well, we're doing a story about, who is really running the drone program. And then there's a negotiation take place and the CIA say, well, okay, we wish you wouldn't, but you can say this, but don't say that. And that's what happens. And WikiLeaks stripped away all that and just gave us, in so many areas, I mean, not just the Afghan and Iraq war facts, not just how the US foreign policy, the State Department apparatus actually talks to itself in the Cablegate things, but how the CIA, then the thing that drove the CIA crazy, how their whole electronic what do you want to call it, covert electronic warfare tools that was revealed. There's just so much, so it's vital that to have had WikiLeaks. I wish, I mean, long may it endure. And the state, as you say, has gone after WikiLeaks and Julian Assange by prosecuting him or indicting him under the Espionage Act. And that really, it really is an absolute blow to the solar plexus of the First Amendment. It's basically saying, institute censorship by, something that, a thing that lay dormant. We thought we'd settled all that with the Pentagon Papers case, when the Supreme Court agreed that it was in our interest to have the government's lies exposed and the truth told. And under Obama, we saw beginning of a reversal of that, as you described so well in your book. And, now with the attempt to put Julian Assange in jail for the rest of his life, we see, the full malign plan to curb the press, something which the press is sort of fitfully waking up to, with not much energy, I must say.
Well, I have to confess that you reminded me of an example that I neglected to include in my book, and it was what the Washington Post had to write the day that Julian Assange was indicted. And I just have an excerpt here for people. I found this to just be staggering by perhaps a quintessential illustration of the attitudes or culture of the US press, primarily, where this editorial was that Mr. Assange is not a free press hero. Yes, WikiLeaks acquired and published secret government documents, many of them newsworthy as shown by their subsequent use in newspaper articles, including in the Post. But contrary to the norms of journalism, however, Mr. Assange sometimes obtained such records unethically, including, according to a separate federal indictment unsealed Thursday, by trying to help now former U.S. Army soldier Chelsea Manning hack into a classified U.S. computer system. And then very viciously going on to say, unlike real journalists, WikiLeaks dumped material into the public domain without any effort independently to verify its factuality or give named individuals an opportunity to comment, nor, needless to say, would a real journalist have cooperated with a plot by an authoritarian regime's intelligence service to harm one U.S. presidential candidate and benefit another. And what they are, of course, referring to is what the U.S. press continues to believe was the role of WikiLeaks in boosting Donald Trump and helping him beat Hillary Clinton in 2016, and that he got assistance from Russian intelligence with the publication of those documents, even though they've barely ever been able to substantiate that claim beyond some of the known details from the Mueller investigation when they were investigating and trying to confirm what happened. This seems so stunning as an example, but also just like typical of the US press. Is that your view?
Absolutely. I mean, at least we can give tribute to the Post for, for really saying it in loud, vicious, malign terms, what actually most of them really think. It's a combination of, prejudice, hysteria, ignorance, laziness. I mean, everything that's wrong with them. It's as you said, this absurd notion, idea that, it's evidence-free assertion that somehow Assange was a conduit between Trump and the Russian intelligence, for which is absolutely zero evidence. The whole thing that he dumped things without going through any editorial process, not true, easily, refuted by the testimony of many people who worked with him, and so on. It's just, I couldn't believe it when I came across that. I wrote to them, I said, you still stand by this? Maybe, maybe the editor, whoever wrote it, had been having a bad breakup or, some kind of psychotic seizure and had been taken away. And I got an answer back saying, no, we absolutely stand by this, so they, as I say, at least they say what others think, but that's all that can be said for them. I think, God rot them. What a disgusting thing to publish, in my view.
And I used to think that they would publish such a thing because there was also one editorial board that thing that they published around, I want to say 2011 or 2012, when the documents were being published that are at issue in the prosecution. They very clearly stated that WikiLeaks is not journalism, and they outlined their view. And I used to think that they publish this sort of thing to just be gatekeepers because they're protecting a certain form of access journalism that they prefer over this kind of journalism where it involves primary source documents, and they seem more uncomfortable with that type of journalism. Is that your experience, that you think that those, particularly in DC, are more uncomfortable dealing with like actual records?
Yeah, because I call what so many of them practice managed journalism. As I was saying earlier, it's really a process of negotiation with the state, with the security apparatus. So they agree on the boundaries beyond which they won't go. So I think there was other reasons. I really tried to sort of understand what it was that really prompted this sort of vicious reaction, particularly I mean, let's call them out. I mean, not just the Post, but from the people who work with them, the New York Times and the Guardian. And I talked to people who'd worked on the original releases. Someone said that there was a feeling that I think they're rather an arrogant bunch, you see, these people. And I think they didn't like the way Assange just basically held them in contempt, and rightly so, a lot of them. Who refused. I mean, they wanted to treat him as the sort of the help who had very nicely sort of brought them all these documents, and they were going to treat them. In fact, they were being, certainly the Guardian people they were the ones being irresponsible. They wanted to dump unredacted files on the internet. It was Assange who was holding things up. In fact, that they, I know that you know this too, that there was great frustration on the Guardian's part that Assange was being rather painstaking about it and going through and developing tools for redacting names, which they couldn't be bothered with. I mean, and yet they turn around and accuse him of doing that very thing. But I think that's it. I think there's arrogance, that he had it was also the fact that he was sort of cyber fluent and they weren't. I mean, David Lee, who was one of the more disgraceful, the Guardian journalist who put on one of the more disgraceful performances, he actually admits in his book that he was sort of, he was rather cyber illiterate compared to Assange, and which I was thinking one point where he was telling the truth. And the same, I think William Keller, in a rather disgusting New York Times Magazine article he wrote, sort of makes the same allusion. They sort of resented that. They resented the fact that he was smarter, held them in contempt, could deal with this technology, which they really couldn't. I think it was a common, and threatened their very way of proceeding, which was, as they say, it's kicking over the traces on the managed journalism. I think that's a combination of all that. Who knows? Maybe there was other conversations with the powers that be that actually impelled them to do what they're told.
And if I was reading your feature correctly, you got to talk to one of the people who worked on these from Der Spiegel, John Gates, who was involved, and I think was able to help you understand even more clearly than was already clear that there was this aspect that, and this comes from David Lee and others at The Guardian, that were making up this idea that there was a meeting in which Julian Assange said that people who collaborated with the U.S. military in Afghanistan deserved to die. And it looked like you were able to talk to him and try and figure out if this was in fact something that Julian Assange had ever said.
Yeah, I mean, Gates was very unequivocal. He said he never heard him say it. He was at the same dinner at a Moroccan restaurant in London. He never heard it. He said he couldn't even imagine. He knew Assange very well. He couldn't even imagine Assange saying anything like that. He said, that they were all, they were trying to figure out, who these people were. Were they collaborators? Informers? That was all sort of. Now thanks to WikiLeaks, we understand how the whole system worked a lot better. But this was all very new, fresh information. I might say that Gates, he was not the only one who confirms that the inaccuracy of what Lee says, or potential inaccuracy. Holger Stark, who was at the time, still is, working with Die Zeit as a sort of collaborator on the initial document release. And there's got another Guardian journalist. When Gates said and Stark said, well, we don't remember Assange saying anything like this, then what's called Nick Davies, another Guardian journalist, he suddenly sort of sat up in bed and remembered the same Assange saying the same, remembered, quote unquote, Assange making the same remark, but in Sweden at a different time and place, there was which, where the Gates wasn't present to rebut it. It was just so, and yet this got, that particular smear, it got very cheerfully promoted by Alex Gibney in a documentary, a Frontline documentary that went out on Channel 4, where they're just happy to peddle these things. And that's been really the overall theme of the Assange story, as in terms of the mainstream press, that they're very, any kind of half truth or smear or lie, if they pick it up and run with it.
Yeah, if it sounds good, then they accept it as fact without investigating
Sure.
whether it's ever been uttered. And in fact, actually, it's the PBS Frontline documentary that had it, and then Alex Gibney did the film "We Steal Secrets."
Right. Sorry. Yes, you're right.
That I think also referenced this.
Right.
So
Sorry,
in
that was
some way, both of those films, almost around the same time period, are pushing this idea that Assange wants informants to be killed by his leaks.
And that's hung on. I mean, the whole one of the things I wanted to try to point out in my article, and you certainly do in your book, is that the truth is out there. We know, he's it's common thing. Oh, he's he raped the two women in Sweden. Well, he didn't, and they never said he did, or they were pressured into saying so at the end. But I mean, they certainly didn't make a complaint initially. They said it's a commonly repeated thing that he released the names of people who were thereby put in danger. He didn't. In fact, quite the opposite. It's commonly put about that he abused the hospitality of the Ecuadorian embassy in London, where he lived all those years. He didn't. And all this has been, the refutation has all been very painstakingly established, often under oath. I mean, you actually bothered to cover the trials of both Chelsea Manning and the extradition hearing for Assange in London, where a lot of these, truths were put down. I mean, including the thing that the premier indictment, apart from the Espionage Act, that he conspired, as that discussed in Washington Post piece said, that he conspired with to teach Manning how to hack into classified computers. He didn't. Manning had already done all that and certainly didn't need Assange's help. And all this has been established mostly on the basis of sworn evidence, which is routinely and sort of casually ignored by the reporting on Assange.
And then I want to ask you about, you got a quote from Michael Isikoff, and it's pretty remarkable to me. And I understood that the story that he co-authored and investigated with others at Yahoo News, I understood that it was panned. But to bring it out with this stark fact that there was no interest, you get him to share that the other journalists who might have typically contacted him, I don't know. I mean, he had worked on several stories related to Trump and the investigation into his alleged connections to Russia. And so his journalists had probably been calling him to find out where he got that and if they could track down more details. We find out in this case, they're not really all that interested in the CIA and Mike Pompeo and UC Global and their spying operation against Julian Assange inside the Ecuador embassy and against other WikiLeaks associates, which it just again illustrates the dereliction of the U.S. press.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny that this is a stunning story. And Michael Isikoff is a very sort of accredited journalist, I mean, it's, and his colleagues. But I mean, ask any journalist in Washington, everyone knows Mike Isikoff and knows that he's a very solid, a journalist who's been very much part of the club, if you like. I mean, always breaking stories and so forth. There's this stunning story that the CIA actually planned to kidnap Assange, even to kill him. And the fact that no one called him. The only person who followed up was Megyn Kelly on the Megyn Kelly show, who had Pompeo on a week later and said, well, what about this story? And Pompeo actually sort of confirmed it. He said, the people who talked to Isikoff and his colleagues should be prosecuted for revealing classified information, and that parts of the story were true. Well, hey, what else do you need? If the guilty party fesses up like that, you think it's worth a bit of comment. But no, They weren't interested.
Which, when you think about that, something you always hear from people in press freedom organizations or just plain old DC based journalists, when someone threatens journalists with prosecution, or threatens sources of journalists with prosecution like that, says, I'm going to go hunt down sources for a story, you usually see an outcry from people. But there really wasn't anything from anyone, even though this clip was available
Yeah,
of Mike Pompeo.
yeah, no. I mean, again, it's just not. It's that episode and pretty much everything else we're talking about here really makes it very plain that there are lanes. It's like the highway. You can't stray out of your lane. Like in so many modern cars, if you cross the white line, the thing goes beep beep. It's sort of like that. I feel journalists, there's things you can't talk about. I mean, for a long time, for example, I mean, just to take something from a completely different area, you couldn't talk about the possibility that COVID came from a lab leak or from a biowarfare lab leak in Wuhan. That was not permissible. Then it became permissible, but still, for a long time, you were crossing a line if you brought that up, and Facebook would sort of ban you and all the rest. All the control mechanisms swung into things. So it's how it illustrates how carefully and painstakingly journalism is policed these days. I mean, it always has been to a certain extent, but it's more and more so. And I think, again, something another field, but the whole, recent revelations about the way Twitter has been part of the whole sort of censoring state.
Yep.
Is a very, we have now chapter and verse on that. The whole way they sort of cooperated with the FBI and everything on what we thought in this, we'd been led to believe was this free speech forum, wasn't anything of the kind.
Mm-hmm.
So again, that's why we need WikiLeaks.
And so one of the last things I want to raise here is related to your article, but not necessarily, I mean, it's not in your report, but this deals with Mike Pompeo. And I want to bring up an excerpt from his book, which I understand he bought 2,100 copies so that he could get it on the New York Times bestseller list. This is Never Give an Inch. This sounds like nobody really cares about his memoir, and he has to buy it himself so that he can get it up there. And he's maybe planning a campaign to run for president as a Republican Party nominee. But for the purposes of our conversation, what's important is that he takes a couple pages and he writes about the Vault 7 revelations and what this meant to him. And if we're trying to figure out if he really, in fact, would have been involved in planning to plot an assassination campaign against Julian Assange, you can just read these 2 pages and see how angry he is. He says, my reaction was that an insider had raped America. The man ultimately at the helm of this operation was indeed an accused rapist, Julian Assange, the founder of WikiLeaks, which I regard as a non-state hostile intelligence service, often abetted by state actors such as Russia. And then if you doubt how far the national security state will go to make sure Julian Assange is put on trial, you can just read from Pompeo here, where he says, ultimately, while we weren't able to bring Assange onto U.S. soil during the administration because of legal challenges in the United Kingdom, we laid the groundwork for the ultimate outcome, which I do believe will happen one day. I will be delighted the day he is thrown into an American federal penitentiary, just one less useful idiot for Russia to exploit, and a warning to all such scoundrels in the future. It's right out there in the open that Pompeo and these other people want to see him dead. And I think it's up to people like us, at least if the others in the press aren't going to take notice, that we need to do something about this glaring human rights abuse that they're trying to carry out.
Yeah. I mean, and to me, the operative words in that last bit was a warning to others. I mean,
yeah,
this is it. Watch out. And that's why I think the attitude of the press has been so inane, that they refuse to accept that he's coming for them, even though their their truth commission is on a far more muted scale than Assange. But this is it. And I feel that they'll sort of the lack of protest. I mean, we have, as I mentioned in the piece, there has been this joint letter signed by, from emanating from the New York Times, the Guardian, Le Monde, El País, and Der Spiegel. I know, and certainly in the case of the New York Times, that wasn't allowed to go anywhere near the newsroom or the editorial team. It was done through the legal office, the counsel's office, and in direct coordination with the publisher. And then they had a kind of a pissy news story follow-up by Charlie Savage. But and that was actually that letter was the work of a true hero, I believe, Jim Goodale, who was the lawyer who won the Pentagon Papers case for the New York Times. And has done so much for the First Amendment, not just with that case, but with others too. He's 89 years old, and he is the only real establishment figure who's still in the establishment. I mean, I'm not counting people like Dan Ellsberg or Noam Chomsky, but I mean, Jim is, with a big sort of white shoe law firm still in New York. He's the only person who's sort of come out and said this is what it is, and has resolutely defended Assange for years. He got this letter published, but what good will it do? Not much, I'm afraid.
Well, at that same time, Holger was also coming out there and pointing to the press and saying all 5 of these main organizations that published these leaks and benefited had done nothing to show support for Julian Assange. And so, I mean, it does feel like there might be some kind of a trend shift. I look at Australia with great interest to see if they can continue to make a political issue out of it, because certainly here in the US, we can't make a political issue out of Julian Assange. There aren't, I mean, you were focused on the press, but in your reporting, you could have also documented the complete and utter lack of interest among the political class in the US to examine or follow this case, because there are parliamentarians in Europe that care. And here we maybe have like 3 or 4 Congress people who could tell you what's happening with Julian Assange's prosecution.
Yeah, no, I don't know. I don't know who they are, but I bet you half of them would endorse the prosecution. In Europe, I mean, you've got German parliamentarians, particularly in Germany, there's quite a fuss about this. Although, as I think it was Assange's brother pointed out to me, that a lot of these parliamentarians in opposition, they were gung-ho for Assange. And now some of them are in government, and they've rather muted their position. I mean, to me, and the same thing in Australia. I mean, the government there in opposition were very stout and forthright on behalf of Assange, and I'm afraid the signs from the Labour government there now are not very, don't make me feel very optimistic. It's this is at the end, the whole sort of system of imperial control is so powerful, and once they get into government, I don't know what the secret briefing is, but what it must amount to: do what you're told or else, because you see how people collapse like wet paper bags so often when they get into so-called power.
Well, in both the cases of the UK and Australia, you have the diplomatic relationship and the arrangements and the military and intelligence assistance to hold over those countries, and you can withhold certain things from your allies if you don't get the sort of consent that you want for this prosecution.
Yeah. I mean, this is, it's like far bigger things. The last Australian government tore up a signed contract, multi-billion-dollar arms deal with France in order to have one with the US, basically on orders from Washington. So, you think they're going to sort of going to make a stand on the case of one individual who's being, who the US wants to lock up and torture? I don't think so.
All right. Well, Andrew, thank you for this report and putting the focus on the media and making sure that the press are at least known for what they've done to misrepresent Julian Assange's case. It was a very thorough and detailed feature, and I mean, thank you to Harper's for printing it. I mean, there's not a whole lot of reporting out there and coverage of this, anyways, and to be in a magazine, to have this kind of story is definitely welcome when we're talking about what is at stake with press freedom if this goes forward.
Yeah, let's hear it for Harper's. I never had any. Wasn't like I had to battle to get it in. They were very supportive all the way through.
To pick up a copy of Guilty of Journalism, go to 7stories.com. There you can pre-order the book, which is out on March 7th. And if you want to become a subscriber of The Dissenter, there will be details going out on how you can get copies at a discount if you are a subscriber of the Dissenter newsletter. The Dissenter is where you can follow stories on whistleblowers and related press freedom issues, as well as the latest updates on Julian Assange's case.